Really?
Is that
Yeah.
true? We have school this week and next week, and then it's all over.
But we're only on chapter 9.
So we do chapters 9 and 10. No, we're due chapter 10. We're in chapter 10 today,
Oh.
aren't we?
No, I meant in like, how are we going to get all the chapters done within 2 weeks?
We have chapters 10 and 11 this week, and 12 and 13. The book has 13 chapters, is that right?
Yeah. When was
Yeah.
chapter 9 due?
Last Saturday, I think chapter 9 was due.
No, I
That
thought
was
that was
chapter 8.
chapter 8.
Oh, well then chapter 9 must be due the middle of this week.
Wednesday.
But in class, we're going to talk about chapter 10 today and Wednesday, and then chapter 11 on Wednesday and Friday. And chapter 10, got you, Carla, and Celeste. So we're on chapter 10, page 375 today, cities and urbanization. And have you been to the Canvas discussion page for today?
Nope.
Well, it says, I think what it tells you to do, maybe I didn't write it down here, I think it says to research the history of your hometown. So I picked Raymore for my hometown city. I actually had a toss-up. I said, so do I pick Raymore, where I've lived for the last 18 years, or do I pick Enid, Oklahoma, where I lived for the first 18 years? And I decided to pick Raymore. Now, it could be that some of you also live in Raymore. So you're going, hey, he just did one of our cities. But I didn't do everything. I just wrote a brief description. Is that Anna here?
Yes. Good morning.
And Adrian?
Yes, sir.
And Drake?
Yes, sir.
Well, I'm glad to have you all in class today. We're in chapter 10, talking about cities and urbanization. And your Canvas discussion question is to research the history of your hometown. And I thought I would take some time here to show you how to do that. So I'll just go up here, and I picked for my hometown Raymore, Missouri. So I just type in, what did I type in? The history. Now, maybe I should do this first. Okay, I'll just type in Raymore, Missouri. There it is. Raymore, Missouri. Well, we'll click on that one. Okay, so here's the city of Raymore. And I click on that one. And they don't tell me anything about the history of this city. They're just all caught up in what's going on today. So I go back and say, let's see, I don't want map or directions, I want the history. So I go, maybe this will give it, Raymore, Missouri, Wikipedia. And it says it's a city in Cass County, Missouri, within the Kansas City metropolitan area. Did you know we're part of the Kansas City metropolitan area? I mean, when you think of Kansas City, do you think of Kansas City, Missouri, or Kansas City, Kansas?
Kansas City, Missouri.
People on the Kansas side think of Kansas City, Kansas. When geographers talk about the metropolitan Kansas City area, they draw a circle around the core of Kansas City, Missouri and Kansas City, Kansas, which is the downtown area where you see the tall buildings on the Missouri side. I guess there aren't any tall buildings on the Kansas side, are there? But then they draw a circle that's probably as big as clear up to the airport and clear down here to include Belton and Raymore, clear out using Lee's Summit, Johnson County. They say that's the Kansas City metropolitan area. Because basically, all of those people live and work in the Kansas City area. Sometimes geographers refer to Belton, Raymore, Lee Summit, what's north of the river? Gladstone, Parkville. They refer to all of those areas as bedroom communities. Any idea why geographers would call them bedroom communities?
It's where people live.
That's where people go to sleep at night and then get up and drive back downtown to go to work tomorrow. Have any of you ever been caught in the rush hour traffic around here? Where you say, oh, look what time it is. I don't think I'm driving anywhere now. I will go to the library and do some research and leave in 2 hours and get home faster than if I would have left an hour earlier and got caught in the traffic jam. And part of it is, if you look at a map of Kansas City with all of the stuff going around the outside, that great big loop of interstates, that kind of helps you see what they call the metropolitan area when they talk about it. So let's see if this Wikipedia is going to help me learn something about the history of my hometown. Raymore is one of the fastest growing cities in the state of Missouri. What is that all about? Raymore was growing so fast that the water pressure was failing because they only had one tiny little water tower outside of town. And now, with the way the city's grown, they've built another one right next to the little one that's probably 5 times as big. It's funny if you drive down the road headed down to Peculiar from Raymore and see that big water tower, and you go, what's that all about? See, because of the growth here in Raymore, because a few years ago we were having water pressure problems. Raymore was platted in 1874. Aha, Wikipedia is going to help me here. The name of Raymore is an amalgamation of the surnames of 2 railroad men, Ray and Moore. A post office called Raymore has been in operation since 1872. And guess what happened? The Postal Service recently decided that they didn't need a Belton and a Raymore post office, so they were going to give Raymore. Does anyone live in Belton? You don't know the zip code for Belton? Anyone know the zip code for Belton? The area code?
The zip code, isn't it 64012?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Well, the Raymore zip code is 64083, and someone said the Postal Service was thinking about changing that to where we would have the Belton post office would service Raymore, and the people in Raymore got all bent out of shape and said, no way, we're not giving up our post office for our visitors. We're in a chapter studying cities and urbanization today in geography class. So, and one of the assignments that I gave the students on Canvas was to write a brief history of your hometown. And I picked Raymore as my hometown. So I'm showing them how to find the history for it. And the city the Postal Service was going to do away with the post office, and Raymore had a fit. So now we have a little post office in Raymore that it's a big building, but they only use a small portion of it because all the mail from Raymore is taken to Belton to be processed before it goes to the downtown area to be shipped wherever it's going. So the people in Raymore still have a post office. The Postal Service smiles and says, yes, you still have your zip code and you still have a postal clerk, but the truth is that all of your mail is processed out of Belton. So if you want something to go out the next right away, you drop it in the Belton post office, not the Raymore post office. But it's just a matter of the Postal Service is trying to streamline the way they do things, and Raymore says, you know, we've been here a long time and we're not giving it up. Do any of you have a hometown where the post office has disappeared? My mother grew up in a little town in Oklahoma called Hillsdale, Oklahoma. And those people get their mail from someplace else. Their mailing address isn't Hillsdale, Oklahoma anymore. It's something else. And I'm thinking, why did the people of Hillsdale let that happen? Oh, when my mother was a child, Hillsdale had like a a grocery store, a post office, a hardware, a lumber yard, a gas station, a couple of grain elevators, and now I think they only have the gas station left. Have any of you come from a small town where the town just disappeared?
We lived for a while in Kingsville, Missouri.
Okay, Kingsville, Missouri.
I used to tell people that there were more cows than people.
And it's like what happened. It used to be a thriving town, and it just withered up, and everything's gone. And so when you look at the history of your city, Raymore is one of the fastest growing cities in Missouri. It's like, why is that? Well, it just became a popular suburb of the Kansas City metropolitan area. Like at Lee Summit one time was the fastest growing area, and now Raymore is picked up. And people who live in Raymore go, man, what's going on here? I mean, I've lived here in Raymore for 18 years, and it used to be between my house and 71 Highway, there were 2 traffic lights. And now there's more than you can count. I get so sick of it. When I come to school, I don't come down 58 Highway. There are too many traffic lights and too many cars. I go to County Line Road where there are no traffic lights. And then they put in a roundabout. I'm telling you, the English have invaded America. Roundabouts. What is that all about? What's scary is most people don't know how to use them, so you're going to get run over in a roundabout someday. And the signs up there, I mean, you're going around the roundabout and it's got a sign, this lane can only go here. It's like, do we stop in the roundabout and read the signs and figure out what they mean? Does anyone know why they put those roundabouts in?
It's supposed to be faster than a
So
stoplight.
people don't have to stop at a stop sign and go again. This is like it'll save on fuel because we just keep going 20 miles an hour and drive around in circles till we figure out where we're going. And you can tell people don't know who's supposed to yield. It's just crazy. Okay, let's get back to the history of Raymore. So it says the city of Raymore, where did it say that there? Was named after 2 railroad men, Ray and Moore. Except Ray, his last name was spelled R-A-E. I mean, I looked up the real history of Raymore, and Moore was M-O-O-R-E. But they named the city after these 2 guys. And then they talk about the government here, see, and the geography. What's it say? The city has a total area of 17 square miles. What are they talking about? Raymore is a tiny little place on 58 Highway. 17 square miles would be 4 miles by 4 miles would be 16. You can't even go 4 miles north of Raymore. If you go 2 miles, you're at the county line. 4 miles, you're clear over to 71 Highway, and 4 miles the other way, you're out in the country. You're beyond Highway 291. Oh, well, see, have you ever seen little signs where you're driving around your hometown and it says city limits? When I was growing up in Oklahoma, I'd drive to Oklahoma City, and 30 miles outside of town, it said Oklahoma city limits. And I'm going, what is this? And the city just decided to annex all that land, and here's why they did it. Because they used to be the largest city in America geographically. So they expanded their city limits just so they could get their name in some kind of record book to include a whole bunch of farmland in their city. So sometimes cities do that, but Raymore has not always been that big. It's been just a tiny little place on the other side of Belton. And we might as well talk about this now. Here's Belton. How many miles is it to Raymore? About 6. How many miles is it to Peculiar? About 6. How many miles is it to Harrisonville? About 6. Have any of you figured out what's going on here? About every 6 miles, there's a little town. Would you like to know why? Well, we're going to find out here in a little bit, I think. Let's see what else this Wikipedia tells us. As of the 2010 census, there are 19,000 people. Whoa! When I moved to Raymore 18 years ago, there were like 5,000 people. Whoa, the population density. Oh, remember we did that population density thing? Yes. But see, I live on those acreages on the north side of town where there's only 150 people on my square mile. I just smile when I say that because I grew up on a farm in Oklahoma, people. I want a little bit of space. And fortunately, we found it. The racial makeup is 87% white, 7.8% African American, 1% Asian, and 0.5% Native American. Hispanic or Latino make up about 3%. Yeah. There were 7,000 households, with 37% have children under 18. 62% are married. That census stuff really tells you a lot of stuff about a city, doesn't it? The median income is $74,000, according to the city's economic development. Well, look at this. Who's the largest employer in Raymore? The Ray Peck School District, which is on the south side of town. Does this surprise you? If it's called Ray Peck, where do you think the school's built? Halfway between Raymore and Peculiar. Out in the middle of nowhere. Foxwood Springs, anyone know what that is? That's a retirement home. When you drive down 58, you see a little pond. I just have to tell you this. I just like retired people, so when I used to go bass fishing, I would catch 18 and 20-inch bass and drop them in that pond. I got permission to do it, and I'd pull in there and dump 3 or 4 18 or 20-inch bass in that pond. Can you imagine some old retired guy with a little worm and a cork out there, and he throws it out in the water? Probably has a heart attack. But I tell my wife, my favorite way to die is going to be in a boat, catching a big bass. and then going straight to heaven from there. Foxwood Springs is a retirement village. Sam's Club, you know what that is, don't you?
Yes.
That's next to Lowe's. You have to pay to go shopping? I'm sorry, people, but I'm just not doing that. You save a lot of money at Sam's Club. You spend a lot of money to shop there. Cosentino's Price Chopper. Lowe's Home Improvement. Look at how many people work at Walmart. 336, 165 at Sam's Club, 317 at Foxwood, 159 at Cosentino's. I don't know where this rehab center of Raymore is. Does anyone know where that is? The city of Raymore employs 101 people. Golden Corral employs 80, and Minsky's Pizza has 26. Why didn't they mention Pizza Hut or Papa John's? Because they have less than 26 employees. They only went down to 26 and stopped. Well, if that's all I know about Raymore, I could be in trouble. Let's go back and see if we can find something else. So we looked at the city of Raymore. Nothing there worth reading about the history. We looked at Raymore. Where did it go here? Raymore Wikipedia. Raymore Real Estate, Vision, videos of Raymore, new homes. Okay, let's go back up here and let's type in, see if I can modify my search. And what did I type in? History, history of Raymore, Missouri. Let's see what we get now. In 1871, Raymore was named after two of its founding fathers, Mr. George Ray and Mr. Henry Moore. It was platted in 1874. We better click on that. That looks like good stuff. What does it say? History of Raymore. There's a history. I don't know if you can read the history of the population trend, but in 1960, in 1940, there were 207 people in Raymore. In 1960, there were 268. In 1980, there were 3,000. In 2000, there were 11,000. And in 2010, there were 20,000. Jumped in 10 years, doubled. Here's the history of Raymore. So those of you who are doing the history of your city, if you look at the canvas under discussions, and you look at what I wrote for the history of Raymore, you'll see some of this stuff. But if your hometown is Raymore, then for your history, you can just write some stuff that I didn't put in mine, because it was just a brief history, so I just picked out a few of these things. But it says it was the Raymore Township. You know what a township is? The Raymore Township. Any of you know what a township is? When the government wanted to get ready for all the people who were going to move west and who were going to immigrate here from Europe. Okay, we talked about the Homestead Act, right? If you're going to have people going out west to homestead, they can't just go out there and pick a spot and mark it off and say that's my 160 acres and build a home. You follow that? So in preparation for that, they sent a survey team out here to survey all the land and divide it up into townships. And each township is 6 square miles. 6 miles long, 6 miles wide, 36 square miles. Now, I don't know if you know what that means, but a square mile has 640 acres in it. If a homestead is 160 acres, there are 4, let me just kind of draw a picture here. Here's a square mile, and there are roads between all the square miles. Have you noticed that when you're driving through the country? You go a mile, there's a road, another mile. You never check your odometer, you just drive out there and keep going. And it's like, okay, so every mile, so here's a square mile. If you divide this in 4 pieces, then this is 160 acres. That's a homestead. That's where somebody could come and claim a homestead, and they mapped it all out. So you say, okay, this is my homestead, and see there's roads here going all the way around these things. And then over here is another one. See that? So, and on every one of these square miles, there are basically 4 farms. And if a township has 6 square miles, 36 times 4, what's 36 times 4? What? 36 townships and 4 people to a township is 144. You have 144 families living, 144 farmers living on each of these quarters that they've homesteaded. And let's see, when they homesteaded them, they didn't have cars to get around. They had horses and buggies. If you want to see what it's like to drive to town in a horse and buggy, just go south or north of here and follow some Amish people in their buggy heading down the road. And you'll find out how long it takes you to get to town in a horse and buggy. And that's what they had. So basically, the idea was, we'll plot out these townships, and then kind of right in the middle of each township, we will establish a town. And does this surprise you that Raymore was named after these 2 guys, Ray and Moore, because of, see that road going through there? That's the railroad. Does it tell you here? It was named after these 2 railroad men. They were instrumental in building the Kansas City, Clinton, and Springfield Railroad. Does anyone know where Clinton is? On your way to the Lake of the Ozarks, you go through a little town called Clinton. You know where Grandview is? Kansas City to Grandview to Belton to Raymore to Harrisonville to Garden City on Highway 7, the railroad. There used to be a railroad going there, and these guys built that railroad. And then from Clinton, it would go south through all the little townships till it got to Springfield, which was another major city between Kansas City. In fact, between Kansas City and Springfield, it says here on this history thing that there were 8 trains a day that stopped at the Raymore Depot, which means those 8 trains also stopped in Belton, stopped in Grandview, stopped in Hickman Mills. See, between here and Kansas City, stopped in Westport. You understand, all those used to be little townships all the way out here. You can pretty well figure every 6 miles, if you go driving east on 58 Highway, you'll come through a bunch of little towns, or what used to be towns, and if you check your odometer, you'll come through one about every 6 miles. Because those were the old townships where all these homesteaders, where all these farmers were living, and all the people who lived on these 36 in these 36 square miles, where would they go to buy groceries? Well, in fact, if you look at this, it says at one time, I didn't put that online, but at one time Raymore had 3 grocery stores, a drugstore, a hardware store, a meat market, a furniture and undertaking establishment. So anyone who lived in the Raymore Township, any of those, 144 families that need to go to the store to buy something, where would they go? They would get in their horse and their wagon and go to Raymore. And if you're only 3 miles away, then it only takes you about 45 minutes to an hour to get to town. So you get up and get your horses around and hook them up to your wagon. There's an hour. You take an hour getting to town. You get to town and take care of business and do whatever you want to do. And then get your horse and buggy and head back home, and you understand you've pretty well used up all the daylight. So you get back home and say, I spent a day going to Raymore to take care of business. And hopefully you bought all the stuff you needed so you don't have to make that trip for another couple of weeks or so. So there's a lot of history about Raymore I didn't put in mine. But here's the original map of Raymore downtown. But this isn't the city that they just described as 14 square miles. This little city is only like a quarter of a mile square. If you want to see what it looks like, go to old downtown Raymore, where they have their Raymore City Market. Or if you want to know what old downtown Belton looked like, have any of you been to old downtown Belton, where you drive down that main street and they've still got a few stores there, and my grandchildren say, look at the tiny little houses, Poppy. I'm going, yes, that's where a dozen people used to live. Go, what? Yeah, that was sufficient. Have any of you been out to Old Missouri Town to see those cabins that families used to live in? Well, maybe I should take a trip out there with my video camera. For the visitors, these people who live in Missouri had never been to one of the springs in Missouri. So I went to Mammoth Springs on my way back from watching my grandson play baseball and made a video of Mammoth Springs and put it up on our Twitter account. If you visitors want to see some of our geography highlights, it's on CBC Geography. And if you go to it, you will start laughing because I don't have very many Twitter friends. Well, I didn't put it up there to have a bunch of Twitter friends. I put it up there to upload videos that have to do with geography. And obviously, the world isn't interested in looking at geography. These students are, because they need the credit to pass this class. So it tells you a whole bunch about Raymore and about the original downtown city. So see, when it says it was platted, that's what it's talking about. That when it says that the city, where does it say? In 1871, it was named after these two guys. It was platted in 1874. Platted is what happened right there. They platted out those little lots in town, and I think I figured out that there were 32 lots in each of these little squares, and there's 20 squares. And a lot is just a tiny little narrow lot where they put a house. So that had enough accommodations to sell lots to build houses for 640 families. And Belton did the same kind of thing. You'd have to do the history of Belton to find out how it got its name. And then it says it was incorporated in 1877 and became a fourth-class city. Well, I'm kind of offended. Our city is the fastest growing city in Missouri, and it's called a fourth-class city. Okay, does anyone know what class your school district is in? Don't they classify school districts by size? So don't be offended. It's not a judgment about the beauty or character of your city. It just has to do with the size of your city. And so it became a fourth-class city according to Missouri's standards for city sizes. And Ray and Moore were instrumental in building in Kansas City, Clinton, the Kansas City, Clinton, and Springfield Railroad. And they just named it Kansas City, Clinton, so it's probably called the KCS. But it stopped in Raymore. And passengers and crew often stayed at the hotel in town. I didn't even know there was a hotel in Raymore. Maybe we should talk a little bit more about these township things. You know, maybe I should show you a picture of some of these township things. Let's see. So here's where, go to the history, and that should tell you something about the history of Raymore. Raymore, Wikipedia. Let's just go back up here and Google something. Cass County. In 1895. Let's see what this looks like. All right. Now, I don't know if you can read this or not, but let's see. This is Harrisonville. See that Raymore? Okay, that's the Raymore Township. If you Google that on your computer or your tablet, you'll be able to read it easier. And if you can see up here, I don't know if you can see these numbers or not. In Raymore, it goes where? See where these numbers start numbering? Is this what, 3, 4, 5? Up here. I've got to look at it over here on the computer. It's too hard to see over there. Okay, there's 1, 2, 3. Can you see where my cursor's going across there? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 1, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36. See that? 36 square miles. And every one of those square miles had a road separating the other section that had 4 quarters. And this is called the Raymore Township. And right there in the middle of it, see where the cursor is? Can you see where I've got my little hand up there? That's Raymore. And over here is Belton. And if you look at this, and okay, so see, here's Raymore Township. Here's Prairie Township. Here's Big Creek Township. Here's Union Township. Here's, what's it called? Peculiar Township. West Peculiar. And here's Peculiar Township. That's peculiar to have 2 of them with the same name. That's peculiar to name a town Peculiar. So do you understand that there's, and this is Cass County. So these surveyors came out west and laid out these boundaries for cities, for townships, for counties, for states, and mapped all this stuff and surveyed it. And people who live down in the southern part of Cass County live in what? Coldwater, Everett. Can't read that one. Dayton, Sherman. These are all the names of townships. And notice, what's right in the middle of Cass County? Does anyone live in, is Harrisonville your hometown? Ah, so when you do the history of Harrisonville, guess what it's going to say about Harrisonville? Harrisonville is the county seat. Does anyone know what that means?
If you get a ticket, you have to go pay in Harrisonville because that's where the court is.
If you get a notice to serve on jury duty, you go to Harrisonville because that's where they have trials. If you get a ticket, you go to Harrisonville to pay your ticket because that's the center of business for the county. And all of these people in these townships go there. Did I bring it with me? Yeah, here it is. I just got this. My real estate Cass County tax receipt from Harrisonville, Missouri. It says my address is 210 West Elizabeth Drive, Raymore, Missouri. You want to hear the legal description for where I live? Section 3, that's up here in Raymore, section 1, 2, and 3. That's the square mile I live in, section 3, and that section is township 48 and range 32. And those are the numbers that they use to map out all of this land west of the Mississippi River. And it says that I have 5.12 acres and that my legal description is Gore Estates Lot 2. And see, you wouldn't know anything about what that means. Well, if I went to a map, if I went to a map of Raymore, a modern map, there's a street a mile north of the post office called Gore Road. And it's named after the farmer who owned that quarter of the square mile. He owned, what would it be? If this was a post office here, he owned, you come down a mile, the next mile, this mile here, and he owned, actually I think he owned this whole, he might have owned this whole half section here. And he had 2 daughters, and he took part of his land and built a road up on part of it and built a little cul-de-sac and built homes. 2 homes for his daughters and then 2 more homes to sell to pay for his daughters' houses. And I live in the second lot. And he cut them up in little 5-acre squares, so each house is on 5 acres. And it tells me what my assessed value is, and that if I want to stay in my house, I have to send them a check every year for about $3,000. What is that? This is called real estate Cass County tax receipt. You go, I don't care what they say. I am not paying those people $3,000 in taxes. I don't get that kind of service from the city. Fine. You know what happens if you don't pay your taxes? They sell your house in Harrisonville at the courthouse at an auction. I know, because I've been down there a few times hoping I could find a house that nobody paid their taxes on and buy it for what they have to want, for what they want for the taxes. You better pay your taxes or they'll take away your house. And all that stuff goes on in Harrisonville. So anyone who did business here in Raymore City or Raymore Township had to go to Harrisonville to take care of all of their legal affairs. Okay, now you say, what does this have to do with chapter 10? This is all about, let's see, okay, we've looked at this is Cass County, okay. You see where Raymore is, and you see all the townships in Cass County? You got that? Okay, I'm going to go back up here and see if I can find something else. How about Missouri counties? Missouri counties. There we go. There's the state of Missouri, and here is, where's Cass County?
Over there under Jackson.
There, here's Cass County. That little county that we looked at, where we live up here, I live up here in Raymore Township, 2 miles north of the old city of Raymore. And all those townships that were in Cass County, every one of these counties in the state of Missouri has a similar map of townships making up, and all those townships are 6 miles by 6 miles, because it was intended for the United States to become, you ready for this? The strongest nation on the face of the earth by our founding fathers, by being a nation of people who didn't work as a serf on somebody else's farm, but they worked on their own farm, and they sold the produce and made their own profit and became not wealthy people, but financially independent people who weren't at the mercy of somebody else. And our country was supposed to be ruled by a bunch of people who would take time away from their farm to go to Washington or to go to Jefferson City in the state level and serve your community for a while, a couple of years or 4 years, and then come back home and run your farm again. And somewhere in this whole process, all these little farms and all these little towns and all these little communities start dying off, and Kansas City, which at one time was one of these tiny little places, becomes this huge metropolitan city where everybody's moving. Why are all these people moving away from these tiny little towns out in Kansas and Missouri and moving to big cities like Kansas City and Springfield and Rolla and St. Louis? What's the deal? And Joplin? Why are they leaving the farms and going to these cities? Anybody know? Well, my grandfather raised 2 boys and 5 girls. And he told all of them, there is no future in farming, so I'm going to make sure all of you go to college. And the boys went to college to learn to be teachers, and the girls went to college to learn to be nurses. So what did my grandfather have in mind? His boys will move to town and teach school, and his girls will move to town and work in a hospital. They'll leave the farm because he said there's no future in farming. And my dad's brother moved to Wichita after he taught school for a while and went to work for the post office and spent the rest of his life as a postal agent. My dad's sisters, all of them became nurses till they got married and then became stay-at-home moms. A couple of them kept being nurses. My dad taught school just long enough till he could get to know some farmers well enough to where one of them would rent him a farm. he didn't listen to his father's advice. He was college educated, trained to be a school teacher, but he wanted to be a farmer. My favorite picture of my dad is when he is standing out in the middle of a wheat field where the wheat's about this tall. We had a bumper crop that year. My mom took his picture because he was the happiest man on the face of the earth. He had just driven through that 160 acres. It wasn't his land. I mean, it was his, but his mom's dad homesteaded that 160 acres, and he bought that homestead, and he was standing out there in that field where he had driven around this 160 acres with a little machine planting wheat, and then each of those grains of wheat popped out of the ground and grew a stalk, and it was a bumper crop. So on the stalk, have you ever read in the Bible? Some 30, some 60, some 100-fold. So he plants one grain of corn, or one grain of wheat, and out pops a head of wheat with 60 grains or 100 grains of wheat on it. So that means if he planted 300 bushels of wheat in the ground, take that times 100, and he's going to get 30,000 bushels of wheat off of that land. Now, do you understand why, even though my father didn't go to church, he taught us that you don't insult the man upstairs, you don't take his name in vain, you don't listen to people who are critical of the creator of the universe, because he's the one that takes our little grain of wheat and turns it into 30, 60, or 100-fold, depending on the weather conditions from year to year. And even though I didn't grow up in a Christian home, I grew up with a respect for the God of the universe who makes things grow. And you know something? I think that was what the founding fathers had in mind with this nation of farmers. You can't be a farmer and disrespect God. I know the farmers along the river are all complaining. Well, my crops just got flooded, and it looks like I won't get a crop this year. Well, see, I say to that farmer, why did you plant your crop right down there in the floodplain next to the river? And he goes, well, because that's the most productive land. That's where you plant a grain of wheat and you get 100 grains of wheat back. I'm going, yes. And why is that ground so fertile? He goes, I don't know. I said, yes, you do. If you're a farmer, you know. It's so fertile because every few years the river floods and washes silt, fertile silt, over the farm and restores it to its healthy condition to produce 100 grains of wheat again. So don't complain to me about getting washed out in the flood, because the years you didn't get washed out, you had huge returns on your investment, on the grain you put in the ground. But you know, in America, nobody wants to, it's like I take credit when it turns out right, and then if it turns out wrong, I blame God. When in fact, it's really the other way around. You give God credit for what he does on a regular basis to bless our lives and make our lives rich, just like the sun shines. I mean, we take it for granted, and then it turns off dark for a few days, and we go, well, what's God doing to us? Well, you know, I don't know if it's all God's fault. There's a haze hanging over Kansas City called pollution that we studied in the last chapter. We're causing a lot of that stuff ourselves by building these big cities. Well, why did we all move to the city anyway? I mean, I know people who live 30, 40 miles away from Kansas City and come here to work every day. Any of you know people who live that far away? I asked them. I was speaking at a church out east of town, Kansas City here, and I said, why do all the people in this church live here in this little town and drive to Kansas City to work? And they go, because we grew up in this town and we love this small town atmosphere. So they all live there, but they work in town, and by working in town, they concluded, there's no way I want to live in town. I'm going to live out here in small town America. And then drive all that distance to work. I'm going, well, you know, all that driving is causing a lot of pollution. Yeah, well, guess what? That's the price I pay. And they add an hour to their drive time every day because I just want to live in the country and work in the city. But basically, people left the farm because of industrialization, because of mechanization. They moved to the city because that's where the opportunities are. And often the parents encourage them to do that. Go to town and get a job. And my dad just said, no, I'm going to be a farmer. And wouldn't you know, when my grandfather got old and couldn't do his own farming anymore, who did my dad send up there to do his farm work for him? That's okay, you'd say, Dad, my boys will gladly do it. You know, my dad was such a strange farmer. We had a neighbor who was a dairy farmer. Do any of you know anything about dairy farms? Well, they milk those cows twice a day, every day of the year. And the cows don't adjust to daylight savings time. They go on sunrise and sunset. And my dad said to this dairy farmer, you know, it's a shame you never get to take a vacation. He said, well, that's the life of a dairy farmer. He said, well, he said, you know, I think I could fix that. I could send my boys over to milk your cows. He had like 50 of them. He said, well, it's pretty complicated. He said, well, they're pretty smart boys. He said, I'll send them over and you teach them how to do it. And then you can take a vacation. And he said, what's that going to cost me? And my dad says, nothing. They'll be glad to help. And what do you think happened if I said, Dad, I got other things to do? I mean, he just said, you eat at this table, you sleep in this house, you do what I tell you to do. That's the price of having a roof over your head, boy. Now go over there and take care of that dairy farmer. I'll never forget it. I went over to this dairy farmer's house, and he said, don't change the channel on the radio. The cows like this station. I never heard of cows even listening to the radio, let alone liking a station. But then after I worked with him for a while, I thought, his cows are strange. And they give more milk when they're happy little cows, so we did all the stuff to keep them happy and to put the machines on them. I mean, we didn't milk them by hand. We did that at home with our 2 or 3 that we had. But up there, we just put those machines on, and all the milk went into a great big vat, and a big truck pulls in and hauls it away from the farm. You know where it took it? Took it to town, where they put it in bottles and sold it to you in the grocery store. I'm amazed. I like to take little kids to the store. You know, it's like, where does this milk come from? And what do they say? The grocery store. Where do these apples come from? The grocery store. The grocery store doesn't grow any of this stuff, people. It's taken in someplace else. Remember when we did the thing on our favorite food and where it comes from? I get this can of Hy-Vee peaches and it says it came from Des Moines, Iowa. They don't have a peach factory in Des Moines, Iowa. So I called those Hy-Vee people and I said, this can of peaches says it comes from Des Moines, Iowa. Do you have a canning factory there? No, our canning factory's out in California. Oh, where they raise the peaches. It just says from Des Moines, Iowa, because it's, look at it, it says distributed. But she said, if you tell me the number on the can, I can tell you which place, which canning factory it came from in California, and I can tell you whether the peaches in the can came from California or came from China. I said, you get some of your peaches from China? She said, when the peach crop in California doesn't do very well, people still want peaches, so we buy them from China. How come people in this world don't know that? Where does all that meat come from that's in the store there? There's a guy behind the counter chopping it up. Where did he get it? It came from a farm somewhere. And my wife goes, TMI, TMI. I don't want to know where all this stuff comes from. I just want to buy it and cook it and eat it. I say, well, since you're getting grossed out by this, let's talk about where your eggs come from that you make scrambled eggs with. Now that's a cool process. I'm trying to figure out who was the first guy that thought, I wonder if we could crack those and fry them and eat them. I'm thinking he got the idea because probably a chicken laid an egg and it broke, and he saw some animal licking it up, and he said, if it tastes good to them, I might have to try it. And he cooked one, and voila, we've been eating omelets ever since. Okay, so now you know how to do the history of this thing, and you see the big picture. It's really cool the way it's all put together. We need to get through this chapter because we only have a day and a half for this chapter, and I've already used up most of today. So let's talk about page 375, where it says, let me turn this off here, where it says, political unrest and violence are leading factors driving rapid urban growth, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So, are you understanding that I said the reason people left farms and went to the cities in the United States was for jobs? Did any of you move to the city from a farm to go to work? Your parents, did your parents move to the city from a farm to go to work? Did your grandparents move to a city from a farm to go to work?
Yes.
And do they still talk about the farm?
Oh, yes.
I mean, once you've tasted farm life, you just don't ever want to forget it or get over it. But in some countries, see, we don't realize how blessed we are here in this United States. In some countries, political unrest and violence have driven people into the cities for safety. And that's sad. And it says especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, it isn't like they're just picking on Africa, but remember if you look at a map of Africa, there's all these countries, and all of these countries are built around tribes. I mean, if the United States, if the people in the United States lived like some of the countries in Africa live, Texans would declare war on Oklahoma every now and then and decide to annihilate them because they weren't worthy of living.
Heck yeah.
Isn't that sad?
No.
No. Okies would declare war on Arkansas. No.
They'd be too scared.
They better not, because they'd lose real fast, wouldn't they?
Those Arkansas people are crazy.
And Kansas would declare war on Missouri. No, it's the other way around. Missouri declared war on Kansas because Kansas was thinking about becoming a free state, and Missouri wanted them to become a slave state. So they declared war on those people over there and said, drive those free state people out. Let's make this a slave state. And a lot of this stuff that has to do with our history has to do with slavery. But are you ready for this? In Congress, prior to the Civil War, Congress passed a Homestead Act so that everyone in America could go, leave wherever they lived, and claim a homestead for their own, live on it for 7 years, and they would own it. And the people in the South said, we don't like that idea. If that were the case, I mean, think about it. Okay, Congress passed it, but a Southern president, a president from the South, vetoed it, and there weren't enough votes to override it. But once the Civil War broke out, and once the congressmen in Washington who were from the South and who said the South is going to separate itself from the United States and become a country unto itself, then once they all left Washington, then when Abraham Lincoln became president, they passed the Homestead Act. But think about this. If you're a slave in the South and you heard a rumor that if you could get out of here, if you could escape at night and get away, you could go to Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, Colorado, and claim 160 acres and start farming it, and in 7 years it would be yours and you'd live on your own. What do you think would have happened to slavery in the South? I mean, wouldn't there be, a lot of slaves escaped anyway, but wouldn't there be just a mass exodus of slaves leaving as fast as they could because there's some place to go? And the South wanted to maintain that slavery mindset with a few people owning all the land and everybody else working on the land. But the American ideal was, no, everybody gets his homestead. And when we go to chapter 11 and talk about the states, I'm going to go back to this family thing and show you something about my ancestors in Oklahoma. I actually have a map of the 1905 Oklahoma map that shows who lived where on these homesteads. And on my dad's side, his dad's father homesteaded north of Gibbon, Oklahoma, and his mother's father homesteaded south of Gibbon, Oklahoma. And they met by coming to probably Gibbon to some kind of common meeting place, and they met there and ended up getting married, and that's how he became my father as a result of these two homesteaders. And I'll show you a map where that would have been what, my great grandfather, my two great grandfathers on my dad's side of the family have their names on a map of Oklahoma as people who owned those quarters of ground, that 160 acres that they homesteaded. Now, a lot of homesteaders, after they lived there a while and owned it, they sold it and moved on to something else. In fact, my great grandfather sold his homestead and moved to Texas because he heard irrigation farming was going to be a thing that was going to make people rich in Texas. So he moved to Texas seeking riches, and it didn't work out. But then after he lost all of his money, he had to come home and live with one of his daughters because he didn't have any place to live when he came back up here. Another factor driving rural to urban immigration is conditions of poverty for farming communities. There just isn't enough farm here to support all of these children, so we leave the farm and go to town to get a job. Those who can't make a living in the countryside seek employment in the city. Say, well, what happens if you come to the city and you can't find a job? I'm going, what? How could you come to Kansas City, to the metropolitan? I mean, think of a big circle again that includes all of Kansas City, Missouri, all of Kansas City, Kansas, from the airport, maybe clear down to Harrisonville, to Peculiar, well, probably to Belton and Raymore and that big. Take a big circle. How could you move to this part of the world and not find a job? Or do you mean you can't find the job that you want? When I moved here to come to Calvary as a student from a farm in Oklahoma, my first job was mowing grass for people in Johnson County. They would pay me to run their lawnmower and mow their grass. And I'm thinking, hey, I'll take that. And then one time, a lady said, you know, when there's no grass to mow in the wintertime, my children have allergies, and I will pay you the same money per hour that I pay you to mow the grass to come inside and clean the house to keep it free of pollens for my children. And I said, I don't mind working inside for the same money I worked outside. And then eventually, a friend in Oklahoma said, so what are you doing to pay the bills, Tom, in Kansas City? And I said, well, I clean the houses and I mow grass. He goes, well, my brother works at Commerce Bank. Anyone ever hear of Commerce Bank? And he said, you ought to give him a call when you get back up there, and he might be able to get you a job at the bank. So I came back from Oklahoma and I called Buck's brother at Commerce Bank, and he had a secretary. And I'm going, whoa, he must be a pretty important guy. I said, well, his brother in Oklahoma told me to call him that he might be able to help me out. And she said, just a minute. And she said, yes, Mr. Payne said he was expecting your call. Let's make an appointment. So I made an appointment to go see him. When I got to the Commerce Bank to ask this guy if he knew how I could get a job at the bank, he was the personnel manager. He was the guy who hired people to work at the bank. And he said, I've got a number of jobs. Let's talk about which one would fit you. And he gave me a job working at a bank. And you know what? If I would have been a traditional worker back in the 60s when I came to school here, I probably would have stayed at the bank for the rest of my life. But instead, I decided, as God led me through my teaching career, through my education here at Calvary, decided to become a teacher. And the rest is history. And if you're going to be a teacher, you're probably going to live in a city. So I married a city girl, raised 2 city daughters. My dad used to love it when I would bring them to the farm. They would ask if they could go out and pick eggs. And they would ask if they could play in his dirt street. They used all these city terms for farm things. But again, all of my brothers and sisters left the farm too and moved to the city and went to work in industrial America. And I think it's neat that even to this day, people from, do any of you know someone who's moved here from a foreign country and found a good job and they're working someplace and making a good living? In fact, they're making a good enough salary to where they not only have enough money to provide a house, to buy food, but they're shipping money back home to family members who don't have as much. Do any of you know someone like that? Well, let me tell you something. That didn't just happen in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s. It's still going on today. That there are people who move here and get jobs that pay far more than they ever dreamed of making when they lived wherever they came from. And they usually make enough money to where they feel guilty about spending it all on themselves, so they send a lot of it back to their family in the part of the world where they came from. So someone says to me, I can't find a job. I say, no, what you mean is you haven't applied for a job that you don't want. Where's the last place people in your age group want to work?
McDonald's.
What?
Yes.
Labor.
McDonald's.
Do what?
McDonald's.
McDonald's.
It's the worst place
I do not
ever.
want to work in fast food. When I was advising students here, I had a student who needed a job, and I said, so have you applied at any of the fast food restaurants? And he said, I don't want to work at McDonald's. I said, okay, what about Subway? He goes, what? I said, if you don't like McDonald's, apply for a job at Subway, because there was a Subway here in town. Guess what this guy did? He applied for a job at Subway. He went to work there. The guy who owned the store said, you are so good at this, I would like to put you in charge of the store. So they made him the manager of the Subway shop. After he graduated, the guy who owned it said, you know what? If you'll go into partnership with me, I'll put up the money to open up a new Subway and we'll have a franchise together. And now this guy owns 2 or 3 Subway restaurants, franchises. And what did he say to me when we were talking? I don't want to work in a fast food restaurant. And now he owns 2 or 3 of them.
I don't mind working in fast food. I just don't ever want to work in McDonald's.
And I'd say, okay, so then if you don't want McDonald's, pick another fast food place to go to work. But just find a job somewhere and go to work and build a work history, and then from there, move on to something else. Why do cities exist? On page 376, why do cities exist? It says at the top of 336, A city is a concentrated, non-agricultural human settlement. So you know right away the city is going to need all this agricultural input from surrounding farmland. Every settled society builds cities because some essential functions of society are most conveniently performed at a location that is central to the surrounding countryside. Cities provide a variety of services. We already noticed Raymore had 3 grocery stores where people would come to town and buy groceries. It also had a school. It includes government, education, trade. There would be a blacksmith shop in town, manufacturing, wholesaling and retailing, transportation, and that would be the train coming through, and communication and entertainment, and business, and defense and religious services. And you would come to town to go to church. Every little township had a town with churches and schools and stores and all the things that people needed. And it happened that Raymore was on a railroad. Have any of you been to Europe where you can go anywhere on a train? Okay, originally it was like that here in the United States. There were trains everywhere. But somewhere along the way, we made a decision as a country, I don't want to ride the train anymore. I want to, how do you get around now? Drive a car. And I think Henry Ford was probably a catalyst for that. I don't know if any of you know this, but when Henry Ford built his plant to mass produce cars, the only people who owned cars were extremely wealthy people, and cars were built one at a time in Europe. You can see some of those cars in old antique car collections. Henry Ford said, I'm going to figure out a way to build a car that when it comes off the end of the assembly line, I can sell it cheap enough that the people who work for me, who make these cars, will be able to buy one. And he began to mass produce cars inside such a price that anyone who wanted to could own a car. And all of a sudden, owning cars in America became a phenomena that everybody wanted. And once everybody has a car, you don't need to ride the train anymore. You drive your car to where you're going. And train transportation just dried up and disappeared. And we replaced it with the automobile. But the city provides all these services. So, page 378 and 379 talk about the 3 sectors of an economy. The primary sector that extracts resources from the earth, that would be my dad who was a farmer. The secondary sector that transforms raw materials into manufactured goods, that would be the person who buys the wheat and ships it off to a flour mill and turns it into a loaf of bread. And then the tertiary sector would be the people who run the shipping companies to pick up the bread and deliver it to all the stores, and the guys who work at the stores to sell the bread to all the people who come every day to buy a loaf of bread. So there's basically 3 sectors of the economy: the primary sector, the secondary sector, and the tertiary or the service sector. Today, the biggest sector is the service sector. In Raymore, you saw all those people who work at all those stores, but obviously those employees don't add up to 19,000 people who live in Raymore. Those 19,000 people who live there, well, if there's for every 4 people, one of them is working, then that means there's what, 4,000 or 5,000 people working. A lot of those people drive downtown to Kansas City and work in all kinds of different places. Page 380 talks about the location of cities. Any idea why Raymore and Belton and Grandview? Okay, first, do you understand that all these townships, when they mapped out all these townships, they mapped out a little section in the center where there would be a town and a school. So do you understand where all these towns came from in America to start with? Was from these townships. But why did Kansas City become such a big city, and why did St. Louis become such a big city? Does anyone know what Kansas City is famous for?
Barbecue.
Barbecue. Thank you. And where do you get the stuff you make barbecue out of? Beef and pork. And do you know, have you ever heard of the Kansas City stockyards? Get on your Google and Google Kansas City stockyards, and you will see down in what used to be called the bottoms, huge arrays of pens where all these cattle from the Midwest were shipped to Kansas City to either be processed into barbecue here in Kansas City, or shipped on to the East Coast, or sold to packing companies that turned it into meat that they sold all over the country. And why was Kansas City so central? Because of trains, because of the river. Same with St. Louis. You can almost look at any large city. Now, why is Harrisonville so big? Because it's the county seat. So some of it has to do with the way the country was laid out into all of these farm acreages, but a lot of it has to do with their location. Location. Okay. I guess we better stop there and somehow try to finish this chapter on Wednesday, because we have to do another chapter on Friday.